Imagine a game that appears to have everything going for it. The developer's last release in the genre was so well received, many consider it one of their favorites of all time, and the only other studio providing a similar experience was too busy digging a hole they might never see the end of. Fast forward to the title's release, and not only is it receiving great reviews, but the majority of people are enjoying it. Overall, the title is a great success. Now imagine this game, despite performing well sales-wise, isn't anywhere near the quality one might have expected. Most elements of the game are okay, but there's nothing extraordinary to be found. Some parts are so underwhelming, one might even say that they are bad. Of course, judging by the title of this video, you've most likely deduced that this game isn't imaginary. It's real, and it's called The Outer Worlds. The Outer Worlds is Obsidian Entertainment's return to open-world action RPGs. It's no secret the title I was referring to previously was Fallout New Vegas. With this massive achievement already under their belt, and bringing the original creators of Fallout to help orchestrate this new experience, The Outer Worlds seemed like a recipe for success. Add on that Bethesda was busy shooting itself in the foot with Fallout 76, and the next yearly re-release of Skyrim, and the hype train is leaving the station. Next stop, take my goddamn money. For all the strengths and advantages the Outer Worlds had leading up to its release, it's a shame the finished product is anything but what the hype would have had you believe. Instead, a game was created that wasn't given enough tender love or care. When I say this, I'm not talking about bugs. In fact, there are so few bugs to be found in the Outer Worlds that it's an achievement in and of itself. Instead, I'm referring to mechanics that feel unfinished, or some of the lazy writing riddled throughout the game. The rest of the video will have plenty of examples to highlight why I feel this way. For now, I just wanted to give my general thoughts on the title.
What's on your mind?
If I had to describe the Outer Worlds in a simple phrase, it would be wasted potential. There are a significant amount of good ideas scattered throughout the game, only many of them are underdeveloped, or implemented in a way that doesn't allow them to reach their full potential. I understand this is a bit of a controversial opinion, so I feel the need to immediately back this up by saying this video will not be a long rant about how much I dislike the Outer Worlds. There are plenty of good things to say about the game. On the other hand, there are also a significant amount of problems. This will be an honest critique of the game. If I believe the Outer Worlds does something well, I will commend it, and vice versa. This video will cover every aspect of the game, from the character creation, all the way to the end credits. This means there will be spoilers from this point onwards. Lots and lots of spoilers. You've been warned. Anyway, I've wasted enough of your time with this attempt of an intro. Let's start talking about the game. The Outer Worlds is an RPG, so of course it has the classic foundation, a character creator with plenty of skills, stats, and backgrounds. You start with 6 attributes: strength, dexterity, intelligence, perception, charisma, and temperament. Each of these starts at average, and can be increased up to a total of 3 times, and decreased just once from average to below average. Much like the special system in Fallout, each attribute is linked to some skills that increase or decrease depending on how you build your character. Besides increases to certain skills, these attributes also grant the player unique modifiers depending on how many points they invest. For example, perception will increase the damage the player does when hitting enemy weak points. Likewise, if a skill is below average, there is a negative modifier applied to the character. I don't believe there are many ways, outside some rare clothing, to change these stats, so immediately these decisions have some weight to them, which is definitely something I want to see in my RPGs. Besides temperament somehow increasing passive health regeneration, the system is pretty competent. It's certainly nothing unique, but it gets the job done. The only thing I wish the Outer Worlds did was give the player the ability to lower these attributes further than by just 1, and give different modifiers every time you raised or decreased an attribute. Most of these attributes give simple percent-based modifiers that increase if you invest more points into them. If a skill is in the negative, it either completely removes the bonus the attribute would have given, like temperament's passive health regeneration, or detracts heavily from whatever modifiers the bonus would have given you instead. These modifiers are nice, but they don't contribute towards creating a unique feeling character. More melee or higher crit damage is great, but it doesn't exactly make me feel more intelligent or strong. I'm proposing a tier-based system, where for each point invested or taken away, some new modifier of varying utility is added to the character, instead of just a flat bonus that increases a little every time. To help my sales pitch, how about I give an example? Let's look at intelligence. In the Outer Worlds, intelligence somehow leads to an increase in the critical damage the player does. Instead, how about int leads to a higher proficiency in science weapons, hacking, and tactical time dilation. Science weapons are tools that tend to have a unique effect in combat, like using a shrink ray to, well, shrink enemies, or a mind control ray. Tactical time dilation, or TTD, is this game's version of VATS. Only time is slowed down, and attacks consume a large portion of the resource. To hack a terminal, you need the required skill level and a varying amount of bypass shoots depending on how much higher your hack skill is than the required skill amount. The first point invested in int could make it so the bypass shoots needed to hack a terminal is cut in half. An additional point could cause the TTD meter to regenerate 15% faster, and science weapon attacks consume 30% less TTD. The final point could enhance the unique effect of every science weapon. Perhaps the mind control ray could control 2 enemies at a time, or if that's too powerful, you could charge a shot which keeps the foe under your control without having to constantly focus on them. The length of control would depend on how long the player charged the shot. This would allow the player to focus on other enemies while having a mind-controlled pet. In contrast, negative points would lead to consequences that vary in severity depending on how many points are taken away from the attribute. 1 point could increase the amount of hack skill necessary to hack a terminal by 25%. The next decrease would lead to a 50% smaller TTD bar. The final con would be the inability to hack terminals, use science weapons, and all science, engineering, and hacking-based skill checks require 25% more points to pass. Honestly, I'm not a game designer, and nor will I pretend to be. These modifiers themselves may not be practical, but my idea while creating them was to try and make them feel impactful to a character build. I wanted the pros and cons to affect the player's playstyle heavily, and be damaging or rewarding enough that players could create different builds for second or even third playthroughs. So now that I've spent a considerable amount of time on these attributes, let's move on to the skills they actually modify. In the Outer Worlds, there are 7 core skills: melee, ranged, defense, dialogue, stealth, tech, and leadership. Each of these cores has either 2 or 3 skills underneath them. Whenever the character levels up, they receive 10 skill points. These points can be invested into a core skill up until the skills underneath them reach 50. From this point, the individual skills have to be increased instead of the core. Each individual skill grants a bonus to the mechanic it represents. Also, whenever an individual skill reaches a multiple of 20, the player gets a bonus related to that skill. This system seems good on paper. A person who has general knowledge of handling a gun would most likely have an advantage with other forms of firearms. Although I've never handled one, so maybe I'm full of it. Anyway, the point is, these core skills make sense. The modifiers added every 20 points add a nice little advantage that are only gained through actually increasing the stat through skill points earned by leveling up. What this means is if the skill is increased by other, non-permanent points, you do not gain the bonus from hitting the next 20-point interval. Although the modifier for increasing that skill and skill checks are affected. They make investing in the individual skill matter, feel rewarding, and help create unique builds for players. The same could be said for the bonuses gained from simply increasing the skill itself. In theory, all of this should be true, but in reality, for most of what I just said, the opposite is true. The issue with this system is that the core skills themselves lead to most builds becoming a jack of all trades. Remember, you have to get an individual skill underneath a core skill to 50 before you can start only increasing that stat specifically. This is a problem because if you want an intelligent hacker character, you also have to be competent at sneaking and lockpicking, which may not fit the character you desire. If you want a beefcake monster that uses intimidation to get their way, you also have to be proficient at lying and persuasion. Already, you can see the god of everything rearing its ugly head. This is what I believe is inherently wrong with the design of this system. There are other issues I have with the skills in the Outer Worlds, but they aren't directly linked to the design itself. The jack of all trades is a problem, but it could be alleviated somewhat through the attributes I went into such detail about earlier. Since each attribute increases the lower skills, rather than the core skills above them, the difference between the skill you actually want your character to be proficient at, and the skills you don't care that much about are wider. This means you have to spend fewer points to get the skills you want to be 50, which then allows you to only put points into those desired skills. In fact, the Outer Worlds already does this, at least somewhat. The problem is, it doesn't do it well enough to effectively combat this issue. The reason for this is attributes giving bonuses to skills they probably shouldn't, like strength increasing inspiration for some reason. Admittedly, this kind of solution won't always solve the problem, but it definitely helps reach the goal of character creation in an RPG, unique feeling builds with choices that matter. Sadly, the other problem with skills in the Outer Worlds make it quite challenging to avoid a jack-of-all-trades character. This issue being investing points into some of the skills feels pointless. The biggest example of this are the modifiers gained from increasing combat-based skills. The stats dedicated towards weapons, one-handed melee, handguns, long guns, etc., don't have a big impact on the damage you deal with those weapons. The passive bonus for increasing them is a higher crit chance, no matter what you choose to specialize in. The damage you deal with those weapons does not increase. While crits are definitely something a player wants to see more of, What's ultimately more important is the damage of the weapon being used. Damage is almost entirely dependent on the gear you are using. You can be a melee build and still do a substantial amount of damage with guns with little to no investment as long as the gun being used is powerful. This makes investing in these skills unnecessary, which leads to them being put into core skills that enhance up to 3 separate skills at a time, only furthering the God of Everything character. These stats aren't saved by the modifiers gained at every 20 points either. Getting a ranged stat to 40 points increases the crit damage of those types of weapons by 50%. This is pretty good, and combos well with the added crit chance gained for investing points in the first place. The issue is, now it takes the player dumping their entire level up worth of skill points to reach the 60 mark in just one skill, and an additional 2 other level ups to reach 80. Already the passive buff of increasing these skills is depreciating over time. If you factor in some of the modifiers at 60 or 80 not being all that valuable, like handguns giving you 20% more crit chance for some reason when investing 80 points, these points suddenly feel like they would be better invested in other areas, yet again adding to the idea of a jack-of-all-trades character. I've only been talking about damage-based skills, but these problems are littered throughout every skill in the system. Medicine is useful to increase because it makes you receive more health when healing, but the bonuses you get for hitting every multiple of 20 are useless. Hacking is nice because it allows you to get into terminals that were otherwise inaccessible. However, the 20 interval bonuses are either things you should already have, like being able to sell to vending machines, or too situational to really be worth investing in. An example is hacking machine-like enemies. For the bonuses that you should have access to from the start, many of them are earned when investing 20 or 40 points. This causes the player to want to immediately put points into these skills because they want to have these basic features right away. In the beginning, you have to invest in core skills, so now you're increasing stats you may not even care about because you want to have the basic features of being able to sell to a vending machine or even upgrade your gear. The last big issue with skills is the Outer Worlds is just too easy, at least in my opinion. This lack of difficulty makes it unnecessary to invest in over 60 points in most skills because the return on investment just doesn't seem worth it to the player. This is a big claim, but I'm going to just leave it for now. I'll justify my reasoning for saying this later in the video when I talk about the gameplay. This problem caused me to stop caring whenever I leveled up about 65% through the game, because the benefits I would gain from increasing my skills didn't have any noticeable impact on the game. My character was already so powerful that any extra damage, healing, or having me use less resources didn't feel worth it. Keep in mind that I am using hard and supernova difficulty as my reference point. This caused me to focus on other skills rather than invest further into the skills I wanted my character to excel at. All sense of progression was gone, and all that was left to do was tick off all the checkboxes the quests in the game told me to do. Now that I'm finished with skills, we can all take a sigh of relief because that went on for a while. The last part of character creation I wanted to talk about is the backgrounds you can give your character. There isn't much to say here because none of them are very substantial. They don't have any impact on the game at all, and most of the bonuses are a single increase in one skill, and it's not a core skill. Some are bonuses like 3% less plasma damage taken, but even then, they're nothing substantial. The only other thing worth mentioning is how all of these backgrounds are ordinary occupations that in no way tell us how the protagonist is a knife-wielding god of destruction. Most backgrounds imply you should be someone that has never been in a fight before. I don't think this is a massive issue, as some suspension of disbelief is necessary in games, but it would have been nice to have occupations that helped paint an accurate image of your character's past. So let's add in some details I've skipped over. You are a colonist who has been cryogenically frozen aboard a ship called the Hope that was sent to Halcyon, a different star system. The Hope is the second colony ship sent to Halcyon, and it contains some of the brightest minds on Earth. The Hope ends up having an issue, and arrives in Halcyon after 70 years when it was supposed to only take 10. Due to this gap, the people stored in the Hope cannot be restored from their stasis without dying. In the meantime, the entire colony is run by corporations who have basically enslaved most people in the colony so the rich can live amazing carefree lives. You know, capitalism or something. A wanted criminal known as Phineas Wells has developed a way to unfreeze the people from the Hope using a chemical called disulfuric oxide. However, he only has enough of the chemical to depopsicify one person. You. Phineas's grand plan is to get enough chemicals to unfreeze everyone on the Hope and use them to free the colony from the board's ruthless rule. The Outer Worlds opens with you being sent down to Terra 2, the primary planet of Halcyon, to meet a mercenary named Alex Hawthorne, who's supposed to be your guide. Only Hawthorne is crushed underneath the pod you use to travel to the planet, and you are immediately on your own. Phineas talks to you during the tutorial section, but until you gain the means to leave Terra 2, you cannot speak with him again. The tutorial itself is pretty quick and serviceable. It introduces the basics of combat, lockpicking, TTD, and stealth. I don't have much to say on the topic besides, good job, Obsidian. You immediately meet some people that are part of a corporation called Spacer's Choice who are trying to ticket Hawthorne's ship because he parked illegally. The ship's engine was damaged during the landing, and you are tasked with finding a power regulator to restore it. To accomplish this task, you are directed towards the corporate town of Edgewater, but are otherwise free to explore the entirety of the map from this point forward. When you first enter Edgewater, you are bombarded with how ridiculous the average person's life is in Halcyon. The town is riddled with plague, and the population is slowly starving to death. There's even a sick house where people are essentially left to die because workers are only given medicine if they are deemed worth saving. This is because the town isn't given enough medicine by their corporate masters to cure everyone. This is the big overarching theme of the Outer Worlds. The corporations in charge of the colony are so blinded by their own greed that they treat all of society as a hindrance to them making money. Everything involving these people is an expense, and like any company, they try and cut corners as much as possible. People even have to pay gravesite fees, and suicide is considered vandalism on the account of damaging company property. It's all absolutely insane. There is a big glaring issue I see with how horrific conditions are in this colony. How did people allow for conditions to get this bad? The world building in the Outer Worlds is practically non-existent, so there isn't much to go off of when attempting to justify how society fell apart so quickly. There isn't any lore about the social policies on Earth prior to the colonization of Halcyon either, so I'm going to base my argument off the precious little we do know and can infer from dialogue in the game. A little side note, there is an interview where some developers from Obsidian mention that their timeline involved corporations running Earth, but since the information they give in the interview is vague at best, and isn't mentioned in the game at all, I won't be considering it as evidence. First, let me put the timeline into perspective. The Hope and its sister ship the Groundbreaker both left Earth to colonize Halcyon in the year 2285. The trip was only supposed to take 10 years, and as you know, the Hope did not make it on time. However, the Groundbreaker did. The game takes place in the year 2355, so the corporations have only been in control of the colony for around 70 years. The first thing that needs to be established is how are conditions on Earth. Well, like I said, we don't really know for sure, but based on dialogue from the game, we can infer some information. The first piece of evidence is the player character themselves. Since the theme of corporate greed is so heavily ingrained into every encounter in this game, the player can comment on the social policies implemented in the colony regularly. There tend to be either two options to how the player can respond. Either viewing the rules of society as an affront to human rights, or you can channel your inner corporate CEO and turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. Often the dialogue for the latter choice is something like the strong survive and the weak perish. It is not based around you being subjected to the same board washing the rest of Halcyon has. With this in mind, one can infer that the player character does not see the corporate society in front of them as the norm. If they did, they most likely wouldn't even have the option of disagreeing with what the board is doing. I will acknowledge that since this is based off of player choice, and Obsidian having to cater to our real-world audience in order to create a more relatable experience, might lead to this not being the best form of evidence. However, some more concrete evidence does exist in the form of Phineas's entire plan to save Halcyon. Phineas straight up says that the reason he sees restoring the Hope's colonists as the only way to save Halcyon is because they are the only people in the colony not brainwashed by the board. Using this information, I believe it is safe to say that prior to Halcyon, the conditions these colonists face are not the norm. With that idea in mind, how did the people of Halcyon allow for themselves and their children to become property of the board? I want to make it clear that I don't believe what happened is impossible. From the get-go, the only governing body of the colony is the board. A government run by corporations will most likely not have the conditions of its citizens as its primary objective. Just look at some governments in the world today. I do take issue with there being no lore based around how these corporations wrested control. There are no examples of open rebellion against them in the history of the colony, and everyone seems content with living their abysmal lives. People in Edgewater even talk about how the town has been good to them, how they were given a home, and a purpose in life. While at the same time they are ravaged by plague and starvation, it just seems difficult to imagine people going from how the main character can act to completely complicit corporate slaves in only 70 years. It would imply that the corporations on the board are masters of propaganda, but the game shows them to be incompetent more often than not. Many of these colonists would have grandparents or parents who had memories of what life was back on Earth. I find it very challenging to believe that people who grew up with some form of social liberty would just allow the board to enforce whatever social policies they desire without some form of resistance. You could argue any information about rebellion wouldn't be readily available, but I wouldn't say that's true either. Of course, many of these people live in little pocket communities and are constantly fed propaganda, But ships are still going in and out of towns. Transportation across the colony is barely an inconvenience. People would spread news via word of mouth. If there was a rebellion, people would most likely hear about it. The point is, the board cannot stop news from spreading when they are trying to silence an entire star system. At the very least, there should still be remnants of these ideas. While there is a faction called the Iconoclasts that do have advanced social reforms, they've only been around for less than 10 years, and they aren't exactly an example of the mass rebellion the board should have caused. Now, if Obsidian comes out with some form of DLC or sequel that addresses this issue, then I'll be happy to acknowledge it and retract everything I've said here. However, since at the start of this video, none of that information exists, and the dialogue from the game paints the picture of an Earth that would not accept what the board is doing, I have to point out this major flaw. Since I've been negative about the Outer Worlds for a minute, let's try and be a little more positive. The town of Edgewater and its surrounding area is a strong beginning for the game. It's so strong, I might say it is the best part. The writing of the townspeople is great, and there are some interesting ideas being thrown around. For example, there is a barber who also doubles as the town mortician who ironically can't pay his own gravesite fees. You discover that someone was recently buried with a golden set of teeth and then convinced the barber to use the guy's dentures to pay off his fees. The same guy with the golden teeth committed suicide, and this is covered up so that the town doesn't have to pay a fine for vandalism of company property. There's even a funny gag where his manager says she has to deal with his gravesite fees because she was the closest living relative. The joke is she actually isn't related to him, but was the closest person relative to his body at the time of death. There's a humorous quest where a security guard will have you join his fight against the automechanical menace. There is no threat of automechanicals at this point in the game, and this guy is delusional, but the whole thing is genuinely funny. Later in the Outer Worlds, Edgewater can actually be attacked by automechanicals, and the entire town will be massacred, except for him. It's a funny moment that I greatly enjoyed. Well, except for the whole town being massacred and all. But besides that, it was pretty funny. Anyway, moving on. This level of quality writing is one of the Outer Worlds' strong points. When the game is dealing with smaller, self-contained stories, it shines. The dialogue and characters and quests are well done, and generally pretty entertaining. Not everything is a slam dunk, as some quests definitely feel monotonous or boring, but in a game like the Outer Worlds, that's bound to happen. Back to Edgewater, people in town will respond to the kind of armor you are wearing. If you dress as a marauder, they will freak out. The corporate guards look and sound like machines rather than actual people.
You're kidding me? Damn. Always thought he was made of certain stuff.
The only negative thing I have to say about Edgewater is its main quest. Let's start from the beginning. You head towards the leader of the town, Reed Thompson, and you tell him about your little power core problem. Edgewater has their own power core, but since giving it to you would cause the entire town to lose power, he isn't exactly willing to give up theirs. However, he provides a solution by telling you about a band of deserters living in the botanical gardens not too far from town. They're using a power core as well, and he proposes you take theirs instead. To accomplish this task, you have to venture over to an old power plant and send all the power to Edgewater, cutting off power to the deserters. This is a win-win situation for Reed because he hopes that the deserters will return back to town once they are without power. With the people united, he hopes to somehow survive the problems ravaging his town. So you mosey on over to the garden, and you meet these deserters. In contrast to the town of Edgewater, the deserters are doing great. They have an abundance of food, and have found a way to fight off the plague destroying the town. The people here have a structured society that allows them all to survive and thrive. They also aren't worked so hard that their lives have little room for anything else. The leader Adelaide even offers you food, supplies, and a home upon meeting her. You can even tell her what your intentions are, and instead of detaining you, she just lets you go. She does ask that you transfer power over to the gardens rather than Edgewater though. So the big moral dilemma is, which side do you divert power to? Edgewater or the gardens? I don't have a problem with the choice itself. My issue is both sides have been built up in a way that there isn't much of a reason to choose Edgewater over the gardens. The gardens don't have a starvation problem, are free from being corporate slaves, and aren't leaving people who get sick to just wallow away and die. The Outer Worlds does try and paint the gardens in a more negative light, but it isn't convincing enough. The first tactic is Adelaide's use of human remains to grow food. It is important to note that Adelaide is not killing people. She is using the remains of people that are already dead. I understand this is a highly opinionated topic that not everybody is going to agree on. Personally, I believe using the remains of people that are already dead to grow food is acceptable under the condition that if you do not, everyone you are responsible for will die. If your religion or culture views this as taboo, then I respect and understand your choice. However, when considering the differences between the two factions, I still see this as minor in comparison to how Spacer's Choice treats their people. There is only one other dilemma the game uses to try and get the player to side with Edgewater. It comes as a last-minute gut punch right before you make the decision on who to transfer power to. Parvati, a companion that has been following you around while you adventure, tells you to choose the town over the gardens. Parvati's reasoning for doing this is that Adelaide resents the town because Reed Thompson allowed her son to die from the plague instead of saving him. Parvati argues that Adelaide would not let many people from the town into the gardens and everyone will die. Personally, I didn't get this vibe from Adelaide at all. There is a line, if you choose the deserters, where Adelaide will confirm that she will not let people who are too corporatized in, but nowhere does she state that she will hardly let anyone in. Resources are limited, and I doubt Adelaide will be able to feed everyone from the town. She cannot afford to accept everyone. The same could be said of Edgewater. The current population is starving. How are they going to feed the people who come back? In fact, Edgewater already kicks people out who aren't deemed useful enough. To me, Adelaide always came across as hating Reed Thompson rather than the entire town. Reed is the reason her son died, not Edgewater. There's even a third option where you can divert power to Edgewater, but convince Reed to step down. Adelaide will agree to take his place, and the town will now be able to survive by both factions coming together. Why would Adelaide agree to be in charge of Edgewater if she so desperately wanted the town to fail? Another problem is Adelaide may be the leader, but she isn't the only person living in the gardens. Unless most of the community would be okay with letting all these people die, I yet again find it hard to believe what the Outer Worlds is saying would actually come to pass. This felt like the developers coming in and speaking to the player through Parvati. They wrote themselves into a corner and needed to try and make the choice more difficult. There is an endgame slideshow that tries to validate this image of Adelaide by telling the player that what Parvati said came true, but yet again it doesn't seem justified. If the deserters had more of a them versus us mentality, I could buy this. If the entire community and Adelaide were friendly to you, but were vocal about how much they hated the town, I could see this decision actually having some moral weight to it. Regardless of which side you choose, the aftermath is done quite well. You confront either faction leader in their now darkened power room. The lighting does a great job of supplying a feeling of hopelessness and dread that is only further supplemented by the music. A tremendous atmosphere is created. I truly felt the consequences of my actions. The voice acting or facial animations of Adelaide or Reed are great and only further reinforce that gnawing feeling. No matter who I chose, I destroyed a community and left people to die because I wanted their power core. I'll give you a point here, Obsidian. This was well done. Anyway, you hop aboard your new ship and kiss the town goodbye. From here the game opens up and allows you to go to multiple places. You can visit the Groundbreaker, the sister colony ship of the Hope, Scylla, a giant asteroid, Phineas's lab, and Monarch, a moon that functions as another planet to explore. Monarch is closed off because the only area you can land in for now is swarming with creatures that the player cannot handle. The main quest wants you to speak with Phineas, and that's exactly what I want to talk about next. The conversation you had with Phineas is fine and isn't really worth mentioning. I'm only bringing it up because it's a great starting point for another issue I have with the Outer Worlds writing. I've been ignoring this up until now, but the player character is called the Stranger for a reason. They are in a completely foreign star system 70 years into the future. If this was me, I would probably have some questions, or feel a little out of it, and by a little out of it, I mean completely panic-stricken. In Edgewater, you can ask people about the Hope, or even tell them your situation, but unsurprisingly, nobody believes you. In fact, people don't even know what the Hope is, which doesn't make much sense since it's only been 70 years since many of the older colonists boarded the Groundbreaker. The questions that you can ask people are limited, and you tend to just say the same thing to everyone in town, with everyone reacting in the exact same way. While I do think there should have been more options to ask the people of Edgewater questions, they are suspicious of you, and are afraid of people asking any questions. It makes some sense that you don't really get any answers. What makes absolutely no sense is that you cannot ask Phineas anything about the colony's history, about his past, or really much of anything. The game relegates your questions to be primarily about the plan to save the colony and the Hope. After you ask your 6 questions, you cannot say anything to Phineas for the majority of the game. I complained about the world building earlier, but based on this interaction, it's blatantly obvious that very little effort was put into it. It feels like the player is being railroaded to only ask the questions the developers wanted them to ask. While this is true for any game, usually this is hidden behind giving the player a wide variety of questions to ask and new information. They leave the conversation having learned something new, or found answers to questions that the developers wanted them to ask themselves. It's meant to be a rewarding experience. Nothing about your conversation with Phineas is like this. Phineas certainly has personality, and the dialogue itself is good, but the insights gained about Halcyon are non-existent. Here's the first example of wasted potential. This great setting where corporations govern all of society in space, and there is almost no world building or history to help expand upon the core foundation. Once you get past the first third of the game, you can't even ask people about the Hope or Halcyon anymore. It's as if the player character has completely forgotten they were frozen for over 70 years because they adjusted their surroundings extraordinarily quickly. Look, I know what some of you are thinking. Who cares? I'm a walking god of destruction that can slow down time and take bullets like I'm Wolverine. Realism? What even is that? I can understand where these people are coming from. Personally, I can't let this go. If you're going to have a character frozen in time for 70 years, then you have to be willing to deal with the repercussions of that event. Otherwise, it just comes across as lazy writing, which is sadly an issue the Outer Worlds has a lot of. After your little chat with Phineas, you land on the Groundbreaker. The ship has been repurposed as a port, and it's the only one that is independent of the board in all of Halcyon. This is something the board wants to rectify, but for now they have to deal with it. The colony ship acts as a kind of hub for the game. When you first walk into the center area of the ship, you are immediately bombarded by neon lights and advertisements from many of the corporations in the game. There's a merchant for just about every item available. The place is both a beautiful sight and a reminder that just because something is outwardly beautiful doesn't mean it isn't ugly underneath. Overall, I have mixed feelings about the Groundbreaker. There's a lot of good, but also a lot of bad. Yet again, the side conversations and writing for some characters are done well. One only has to have a conversation with my man Martin over here to see that. Sadly, the overall quality of the game begins to dip around this point. The side quests tend to be simple: travel to point X, kill these enemies, talk to someone, and then return to collect your reward. Some examples are the quest to receive the medical SAM on Scylla, where you do exactly what I outlined above, and helping Jessie deal with her debt to the board. To help Jessie, all you have to do is walk between her and the board embassy a couple times to square away her problems. These kinds of boring walking from point A to point B and returning back to A quests are found throughout every area you can visit. Monarch has the workers' strike and getting the Bolt 52 for MSI, and Byzantium has another fetch quest that involves finding sprats, and a quest that wants you to travel the entire colony to find beacons that play a pointless message and rewards you with a retro hat. God, this quest was annoying. That's not to say quests like these are inherently bad. Honestly, every quest in the Outer Worlds, and even the Fallout franchise, are fetch quests that have the player running between people and killing things. What makes a quest interesting are the choices offered to solve a problem, the characters you interact with, the moral dilemmas you have to consider, or even the humor in what you're being asked to do. While there are an abundance of quests that integrate these elements in the Outer Worlds, there's also just as many that don't offer anything interesting. I do have to add that most of the quests in the Outer Worlds offer a lot of choices in how you go about solving the problem. In one example, you are charged with breaking into a factory and killing its leader. You can break into the factory by stealthing in or disguising yourself as a factory worker. Then you can decide to sabotage the factory through many different methods. You can speed up production, poison the animals that are used for the factory, kill everyone in sight, etc. Even when you confront the leader, you have many options on what to do with him. Not every quest has this level of choice, but many of them offer some variety in how you choose to complete them. I do have to add the caveat that many of these options are spoiled to the player by the NPC giving out the quest. They will often tell you what the various other options are, rather than letting you discover them organically. Now that I've spent enough time on another tangent, let's return back to the Groundbreaker. The colony ship is experiencing some heat issues, and the player is tasked with getting the parts to solve the problem and then installing them. Sounds pretty simple. The issue is the parts needed to repair the ship are in the back bays, which are now under control of an outlaw group aboard the ship. You can either kill them all, or peacefully resolve the situation. Then you have to fight your way through a new enemy called Mantipillars and some auto-mechanicals. You install the new parts, and so ends the heat problem. So you may be asking yourself, why am I bothering to tell you all this? Well, dear viewer, the reason is this quest doesn't really make any sense. What you do during the events of the quest is fine. The issue is you shouldn't have to do any of it to begin with. The entire problem could have, and probably should have, been solved by the people aboard the ship. The Groundbreaker has a police force called the Mardettes. This heat problem has been going on for a while, and all the leader of the Groundbreaker, Junlei Tennyson, had to do was send down her police force to solve the problem. Instead, she sends down a team of engineers that are accompanied by a few Mardettes. They all get slaughtered. Junlei's reasoning for not sending down a full team of Mardettes to kill the outlaws is she doesn't want any of them to die. Well, according to Junlei herself, this heat problem is pretty dire, and if it isn't solved soon, there are going to be some deaths regardless. Sure, nobody ever wants somebody else's death on their conscience, but difficult situations sometimes require difficult solutions. Another way to solve this problem is to realize these outlaws are also aboard this ship. If something were to happen to it, they have no means of survival. It seems like a pretty easy sell to me. The Mardettes take the parts they need, and nobody has to die. Seems like a win-win. Then they could have dealt with the Mantipillar problem using the Mardettes as well. This just about wraps up everything I have to say about the Groundbreaker. Let's return back to the main quest. It's at the Groundbreaker where the story breaks off into two. You can either hand in Phineas Wells' location to the board, or you can continue assisting Phineas. Except actually turning in Wells has no impact on the game whatsoever. Let's take a few steps back so I can prove my point. Udon Bedford is the board representative aboard the Groundbreaker. You can tell him you know the location of Phineas, and he will be ecstatic. Only he doesn't have the authorization to accept this information, and you need to travel to Byzantium, the capital of the colony, to give this information to Sophia Akande. Except he can't authorize your travel to Byzantium either because he sold off his board seal. I said before the board is incompetent, and I wasn't lying. You have to buy back the seal with your own money, and then travel to Byzantium. Once you make it to Byzantium, Sophia refuses to accept this information. Instead, she asks you to kill someone for her so that she can trust you. During the quest, you can either choose to kill the individual or spare them. Regardless, Sophia agrees to work with you. What was the point of this test of trust if your actions didn't matter in the first place? If this sounds convoluted and ridiculous, you're right. It most definitely is. Normally I would see this as a drawback, but the game makes it pretty clear that it's supposed to be. It's a common theme in the Outer Worlds that there is so much red tape associated with every little action that it becomes impossible to do anything. So what's the problem? You can turn in Phineas pretty early in the game. That sounds awesome. Well, it turns out when you give the board Wells' location, they don't do anything with it. There isn't some big operation where Phineas is taken away and the main story is altered forever. Instead, the board decides to do nothing with Wells and give you another task. Did I mention that the board is incompetent? Honestly, at this point, do I even have to? I understand the whole red tape issue that the Outer Worlds presents, but this is just too much for me to let slide. Look, I'm all for video games not taking away your options just because you made one decision in a game, but this is a different story. Turning in Phineas is a massive choice that the game gives you many chances to get out of. Even if you decide to give Bedford the information, you still have to give the info to Akande, and before you do that, you have to kill someone for her. It's as if there's an invisible person saying, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Honestly, the moment you tell Bedford you have info on Phineas, you should be immediately detained and forced to give the board Wells' location. The people we're talking about aren't exactly humanitarians. They shouldn't just wait until it's convenient for you to tell them, especially because he is the only person that is really fighting against the board in any real capacity. Big choices usually have some kind of trade-off associated with them, or else there isn't really much of a choice to begin with. You can still work for Phineas after giving him up and complete his entire side of the quest. In fact, you only benefit from giving up the man who saved you. You get the bounty on his head, but more importantly, early access to Byzantium. The worst part about this is there isn't much of a difference between either side of the main quest. Whether or not you give up Phineas, you still have to go to Monarch and do the exact same thing. Technically, both sides ask you to do two different things. Phineas needs you to talk to a guy called the Broker who has information about where the board has the disulfuric oxide he needs for the rest of the colonists aboard the Hope. Sophia needs you to silence the propaganda coming from Monarch. Guess who is in charge of the radio tower that broadcasts on Monarch? The Broker. So no matter what, you find the guy and he refuses to help you until you get the other two factions on Monarch to stop using the radio waves that he needs to do business. This is basically what Sophia wanted you to do anyway, so it works out. I want to go into more detail about these two groups. The first one is MSI, a corporation that used to be a part of the board. Some history is needed to explain why they were kicked out. Monarch is a difficult planet to live on. It has sulfur pools all over the place, wild beasts like raptidons and mantisaurs everywhere, and a massive marauder problem. Once upon a time, Monarch was called Terra 1, but due to it being too difficult to survive on, the corporations on the board decided to leave for Terra 2, all except for Monarch Stellar Industries. The board had a rule in their bylaws that stated if a corporation was the only one left operating on that planet, they could claim ownership over it. MSI did exactly this. They also decided to institute new reforms that introduce ideas like weekends and time off. Revolutionary stuff, I tell you. The other corporations weren't too happy about this, so they banned travel to Monarch and labeled MSI as barbarians. The current leader of MSI is a guy called Sanjar. Sanjar's goal is to force his way back onto the board because while freedom is great, being cut off from the rest of Halcyon is a bit of a problem. I really enjoyed talking with Sanjar. He's quirky in an endearing way, and you can tell that he genuinely cares about the people working under him. Sanjar is a numbers guy, and much prefers the comfort of spreadsheets and data to people. This causes his secretary to often tell him to back up and explain things he might have skipped over. Instead of seeing this as a slight against him, Sanjar welcomes the criticism, and only wishes to improve himself as a leader. If you can't tell already, Sanjar was one of my favorite characters in the game. In terms of the overall faction, I believe MSI is easily the best. The people living under this corporation aren't afraid to think for themselves and don't pander on about how MSI has been good to them. It's a welcome reprieve from all the corporate propaganda that is constantly being shoved down the players' throats since they booted up the game. While the Groundbreaker wasn't anything like Edgewater, they felt less like a community and more like a hub of merchants that I could sell and purchase things from. Stellar Bay, the name of the town MSI operates from, feels like a town. I'm not constantly reminded about how much everyone hates their jobs or that they're starving to death. Instead, there's a murder mystery. A mother's child ran away from home and wants him back. Workers go on strike. Sanjar's secretary has a crush on some mysterious guy. They watch sports and bet on who is going to win. While some of the quests I listed aren't the most engaging or interesting around, I can appreciate the shakeup from what the majority of the game has been. The other faction is one I've already mentioned, the Iconoclasts. In contrast to MSI, I don't have many positive things to say about them. In fact, I hesitate to really call them a faction. More on that soon. The Iconoclasts are the antithesis of the corporate regime. Every member has no master except themselves and are free to do as they please. At least that's what they tell themselves. The group has two primary leaders who essentially order around everyone else so that they can survive the conditions on Monarch. These two are Graham Bryant and Zora Blackwood. Graham is a bit of an oddball. He's the kind of guy that cares more about getting printing press parts to spread his group's ideals than feeding his people. Not exactly qualities someone would want in their leader. Zora is the opposite. She's the practical one that actually cares about losing people and, giving them their basic needs. Graham is meant to be the charismatic one that brings people to the cause, while Zora actually tries to keep the people they recruit alive. They're supposed to complement each other, only Graham is portrayed as a foolish idealist who has no concept of his actions having consequences. He is so obsessed with overthrowing the corporations that he throws away the lives of his compatriots without a second thought. In an odd way, this is a good thing. You're not supposed to like Graham, and Zora is supposed to be seen as the voice of reason. The only criticism I have is how Graham is still in charge. The man is a complete buffoon when it comes to leading his people. If Graham has always been like this, I find it hard to believe anyone would follow him for very long. Usually people don't appreciate being sent on suicide missions so that their leader can print new pamphlets. This typically creates resentment, which if allowed to fester, causes people to revolt. This level of idiocy seems a little unbelievable, and is sadly found commonly in the more villainous characters in the game. Good old Udon Bedford sold his board seal for money, for God's sake. One quest involves toothpaste that acts as an appetite suppressant, and the head researcher can't connect the dots that the board will use this to feed people less. There's only so much suspension of disbelief I can manage before it becomes bad writing. Anyway, that's enough about Graham. Back to the Iconoclasts. The big problem I have with them is that Graham and Zora are the only characters in the entire faction. Everyone else is either a meaningless filler NPC, or a named character that you can have one conversation with and then never talk to again. Take Rose, for example. She greets the player when they first enter the Iconoclast home, and afterwards you can never talk to her again. The faction feels void of life. It doesn't help that there are only 4 quests that deal with the Iconoclasts in the entire game, and all of them only require you to interact with Graham and Zora. This is one of the major factions of the Outer Worlds, and you can do so little with them. The only side content available for them is fixing various minor problems around their base. There is an additional side quest given by an Iconoclast named Ash, but it has nothing to do with the faction at all. Ash could be anywhere on Monarch and the quest wouldn't change. That's enough about Monarch and its various factions. Once you help out both sides and get them to stop broadcasting, the broker will finally either send the info to Phineas or agree to work for the board if you didn't just kill him. You can actually do both sides of the main quest side by side. From this point, Phineas will ask you to acquire the disulfuric oxide from the board in Byzantium, and Akande tells you to murder everyone in Edgewater. Either option will lead to a revelation about the colony. Halcyon is on the verge of a complete societal collapse. Crops from Earth do not grow efficiently enough in Halcyon to support the population of the colony. The board's plan is to introduce the Lifetime Employment Program. The Outer Worlds provides a nice video package explaining the details, so let's just use that.
Good afternoon. I'm Chairman Rockwell, and I'm here to address a serious issue facing us. As you all know, our colony has been successful beyond our wildest dreams. Unfortunately, we've recently discovered that our food supply will not be able to sustain Halcyon's population in the long term. Everyone will die. Everyone will slowly stop living from malnutrition. But we're doing it together, and that's what matters. I fucking swear, if someone doesn't give me something to read that will placate the masses soon, all of you will find yourselves violently unemployed. But I can assure you there's nothing to fear. We've got a solution. It's called the Lifetime Employment Program. We will freeze most of the colony to preserve resources, while the best and brightest of Byzantium continue living in prosperity. Look, you idiots! How many times do I have to tell you we can't say shit like that? Fire whoever wrote this! While Halcyon's brightest minds solve the problem of our nutritional shortage, the rest of the colony will be placed in suspended animation. Individuals will be revived on a rotating basis, so that every Halcyonite can be part of the important work of saving our colony. By testing paperweights.
You know, after that, there is no doubt in my mind that Chairman Rockwell and the board as a whole truly care about the people of Halcyon. What noble individuals, making people suffer for the board's mistakes while they live in luxury. Truly an inspiration to us all. From here, both sides ask you to do the same thing again. Sophia and Phineas want you to skip the Hope across the colony, with the only difference being the location it ends up in. Phineas wants the ship skipped to Terra 2, and Sophia wants it placed near Tartarus, a moon where the board houses all of its prisoners. This is the point of no return. Whichever side you choose here is the one you are ending the game with. Don't worry though, because yet again there isn't much of a difference. If you help Phineas, the board will finally capture the scientist and bring him to Tartarus. If you help the board, Phineas will instead capture Sophia and cause a prison riot on Tartarus. What follows is yet again the exact same thing with some minor differences. You run through the prison, fight a big robot prison warden, deal with either Phineas or Sophia, and the game ends. Then you get some slides detailing what impact all of your choices in the game had on the colony. I haven't been adding in my thoughts about the main quest as I went along, because I wanted all the information available so I could tackle it all at once. Now that I'm done explaining everything, I suddenly have a lot to say. Let's start with Phineas. He's funny, charismatic, and an overall decently written character. He's also the face of the good side of the quest. There is no grand rebellion against the board, it's just this one guy. Hopefully this would mean that there are a lot of interactions you can have with Phineas. Well, yes, but actually no. For the entire game, Phineas just stands behind this glass wall and says,
"What's on your mind?"
You can only talk to him about a very limited number of details that are available right after you get the Unreliable. After exhausting his dialogue, no new dialogue is added for the rest of the game. What I was expecting was being able to talk to Phineas about events that were going on around Halcyon. Tell him about your grand adventures, or ask his opinion on a faction that you met. Maybe when you walk in you can hear him attempting some kind of experiment that goes horribly wrong. None of this is available. It's just an uncomfortable stare behind a glass wall for the entire game. There's no personality here, no bonding with the character. I don't have much of a reason to care about Phineas or his goals because I come in, talk to him for a second, and then leave for another 10 hours. Sure, helping your fellow colonists aboard the Hope is the right thing to do, but as a player detached from all this, I don't have much of a reason to care about them. Every interaction is a simple, "Hey, I got that thing you needed done, that's great, can you do this for me now? Sure, I'll be just on my way." Throw in some anti-board comments, and that's all she wrote. Even with the lack of connection with Phineas, he is definitely better than the board option. The Outer Worlds is black and white when it comes to the main quest. The corporations on the board are bad, and Phineas is good. There are no shades of gray here. The video package speaks for itself. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, it only becomes a problem because there isn't any real reason to help the board unless your character is a complete and total monster. The board enslaves its citizens, doesn't provide them with basic necessities like food or medicine, and leaves them to die if they aren't deemed worthy enough. All while the rich just sit around and do literally sweet FA. Seriously, there is a bartender in Byzantium that refuses to serve drinks because that would be work. He directs you to his robot that dispenses them for him. I didn't mention this earlier, but if you don't hand in Phineas to the board and only help him, Sophia will contact you eventually. She wants you to bug Phineas's base so the board can locate and take him in. You can even tell Phineas this, and he will tell you to do it, only he will ask you to corrupt the signal because the board will find him eventually. Not only does Sophia just trust that you gave her the correct location immediately, something she doesn't do if you try to hand Phineas in sooner, but she then asks you to kill everyone in Edgewater. I don't know about you, but committing mass murder isn't exactly the best way to convince someone you should be helping them. The Outer Worlds does attempt to make Phineas seem somewhat villainous, but it's a half-hearted attempt at best. Other characters you interact with will tell you to be wary of Phineas, that he isn't all that he seems. At first I was excited. Maybe the game was repping up for an interesting moral dilemma on which side to choose, confronting the idea that the board may be better than complete anarchy. This warning ends up being completely hollow. The big reveal about Phineas is that in the past he experimented on the humans aboard the Hope to try and thaw those people out. This resulted in multiple people's deaths. While I do not condone these actions, they are nothing compared to what the board has done. Even Phineas's wrongdoings had a noble goal. The board just abuses and exploits people for their own gain. There are also several points in the story that don't make any sense. Why would Phineas tell you to put a board tracker on his ship even if they will find him eventually? He has been in hiding for 35 years. What makes him think the board will find him anytime soon? If they were anywhere close, they wouldn't be asking for someone that has been primarily supporting him throughout the game for help. Which leads into another issue. Why would Sophia think that you would be willing to help her after everything you have done for Phineas? She shouldn't trust you at all. Why doesn't the board immediately arrest Phineas once you hand over his location to Sophia in the beginning of the game? Instead, she just sends you on a mission to Monarch. I know why the Outer Worlds did this, of course. There wouldn't be much of a game if Phineas was defeated, but from a story perspective it makes absolutely no sense. The board desperately wants Wells arrested. He is the only opposition to them in the entire game after all. The iconoclasts do not count. Instead, they sit around and wait until the story demands them to go after Phineas. Obsidian wrote themselves into a corner, and they couldn't figure out how to escape. The biggest problem with the story is how there is no real difference between what you do for either side. Sure, the outcomes at the end are vastly different, but what you do to reach the goal is almost exactly the same with only some minor differences. No matter what, Edgewater is exactly the same. The Groundbreaker is exactly the same. Monarch is exactly the same. The only differences are killing the cartographer for Sophia, killing the entire town of Edgewater, and stealing the chemicals for Phineas. Even both choices have you skipping the Hope somewhere and fighting your way through Tartarus. It's all a massive letdown for anyone wanting to play the game a second time to see what happens on the other side. All this talk about lack of choices leads to my final issue with the Outer Worlds story. Choices don't have any impact during the game. Choosing Edgewater or the Deserters has very little impact on the events throughout the story. If you choose Edgewater, the Deserters lose power and don't know what to do or where to go. If you choose Adelaide's group, people line up outside Reed's office and wonder what's going to happen, but that's about it. If you go back later in the game, things are still exactly as they were when you left. No one has moved to the surviving side, there's no finding a town person's corpse or someone leading a new marauder camp. I've already gone over how handing in Phineas has no impact on anything at all. There's a side quest where MSI and the Iconoclast go to war with each other. No matter who wins, nothing changes in the game outside of the ending slideshow and who occupies Stellar Bay. Sophia will comment if you kill the leader of either faction, but she has nothing to say if you aid the Iconoclast or MSI. I would have thought she would be livid if you helped the Iconoclast, but she doesn't care at all. Maybe Phineas would be happy you help put a group in power that goes against the board. Nope, he says nothing as well. Perhaps the people of Byzantium or the Groundbreaker would comment on some of the new propaganda the Iconoclast started putting out. That doesn't happen either. You might be thinking little details like these don't matter, but in my opinion they are what make a game special. These little details show an extra level of polish was put into a game. The developers truly thought about how your actions would affect your surroundings and put in time to make it happen. Instead, every choice's outcome is shown in the endgame slideshow. I'm not saying these slides are a bad thing, they definitely have their place, and even the ones in the Outer Worlds are great. They tell stories and give information about characters or events that I wasn't even expecting. The thing is, there is a time when the effect of a choice should be narrated to the player at the end of a game, and when it should be seen in-game. One thing I think the Outer Worlds does quite well is its characters. I've spent a lot of time talking about the events transpiring around these characters, but I want to also give the Outer Worlds the credit it deserves in regards to these individuals. Sophia may be betrayed as a villainous character, but despite this, I believe she has her heart in the right place. In your conversations with her, she heavily criticizes the way the board conducts themselves. She genuinely cares about the state of the colony, but due to her seeing the board as the only viable option, she is stuck cleaning up their messes. Reed Thompson isn't a perfect man by any means, however he definitely cared about Edgewater. He saw these people as his responsibility, and chose to only give out medicine to the most productive of townspeople not because he was cruel, but because he really didn't have enough for everyone. He desperately wanted his town to survive. It's only because of the corporation's policies that he wasn't able to provide for his town. These are only 2 examples, and while not all of the characters are great or memorable, more often than not they were a strong point for the game. Another strength the Outer Worlds has is its humor. The game is incredibly funny. Not everything is going to make you laugh out loud, but it is consistently entertaining or witty. A lot of this is done through dialogue. There are plenty of ridiculous dialogue choices the player can use just to see what happens. Often these crazy options create humorous moments with other characters. A guy running a shady shop says the word wink instead of actually winking. Due to this, the game gives you the option to deck him in the eye twice. This may not sound like much, but it was quite a memorable moment for me. Something I couldn't fit in anywhere is how amazing the facial animations are. Characters will always have their expressions match what they are saying or how they are feeling. They even have their eyes lowered when reading off a piece of paper and have them flick upwards when they are finished. It adds a lot to the conversations you can have, and it was greatly appreciated while playing the game. It's just a shame the same amount of care wasn't put into the world building or the main plot. This just about wraps up everything I have to say about the plot, quests, and any other thing I've been ranting about for the past half hour. The rest of this video will be about the gameplay and companions. I believe the discussion about them is just a little overdue. The first subject on the list are factions. I wanted to talk about the faction system in the Outer Worlds because I've spent so much time talking about these groups already, and it seems fitting to bring them up now. There are 2 bars for every group. One represents how badly they want to erect a statue of you, and the other is how much they would rather straight up murder you. Both bars fill up depending on your actions. Everything else is pretty status quo. If you perform an action that a faction would like, their first bar increases. On the other hand, if you work against the interests of a faction, their negative bar fills up. The point of multiple bars is to create a more complex relationship with the player. Instead of a vague, this faction didn't like that, you can see the direct consequences of your actions. The board can appreciate what you've done for them in the past, but if you kill their soldiers, they're going to be suspicious of you. Yet again, this is an example of a good idea, but with poor execution. There are 2 reasons why I feel this way. Number 1 is I would hesitate to use the word faction to describe some of these groups. All of the secondary factions aren't represented in the game at all. There are 4 in total: Auntie Cleo, C&P Boar's Factory, the Deserters, and Spacer's Choice. I don't have a problem with the Deserters or Spacer's Choice. They were meant to be the tutorial factions that introduced the system. Although I do wish Spacer's Choice was renamed to Edgewater. I believe it is a bit problematic that this town serves as 90% of your interactions with Spacer's Choice. Auntie Cleo is represented by this singular questline on Terra 2, and you never have to interact with them again or return to the location once your business has concluded there. Even then, the people that represent the faction are just hired guards or scientists. There is no leader, and you never meet any of the people in charge of the corporation. The faction isn't represented anywhere else in the game except through a merchant found on the Groundbreaker. There are some side NPCs that give out additional tasks, but they are all related to the one primary quest you do for the area. Even then, the interactions with these characters are fairly limited, and there isn't much to them. This one guy likes Raptidon Musk, and that's his entire character. These complaints are also replicated with the C&P Boar's Factory, the only difference being there is a leader of the faction. The trade-off is, he is the only named NPC for the group. This isn't a faction, it's just a guy in charge of a factory with a bunch of filler guards. There are no additional quests, or people to talk to. Complete the one task associated with the faction, and you're done. Some of these problems are even prevalent with the primary factions. The board is the antagonist of the game, and they only have 5 characters that you can talk to. There's Minister Clark, who isn't even really a part of the board, and you can only have one conversation with. Rockwell, who you can't interact with until the last quest of the game. Percival Platt, who you would be forgiven if you didn't know who I was talking about. He's the secretary that sells you items. Udon Bedford, we've talked about this guy enough. And Sophia, the only good character in the faction. This is the big baddie of the game, and the interactions or impact you can have with the group feel limited at best. Outside of the main quest, there isn't a lot you can do for the Union of Corporations either. The board always feels like an ever-looming threat for most of the Outer Worlds. In the beginning, they seem like an indestructible force, but as the game goes on, you realize just how incompetent they are. They're so dysfunctional, it's comical. The player gets a good laugh at their expense, but constantly undermining the antagonist of the plot can have negative repercussions if not handled well. They begin to feel less like a threat and more like a joke. While this isn't the case for the board, they do teeter on the line at times. Their grip on the colony may deteriorate over time, but the board always remains a threat. Moving on from the board, I've already talked at length about MSI and the Iconoclasts, so I won't bother you with those details again. Let's shift focus onto another primary faction, the Groundbreaker. I've spoken about the Groundbreaker before. I mentioned they feel more like a hub of merchants trying to sell you products rather than a group of people. Most of the people you can interact with aboard the colony ship are salesmen. They don't offer any quests or tasks for you to perform and aren't a part of any either. Most lack concrete personalities and aren't very interesting. There are some notable exceptions in Gladys and Martin. Gladys comes up quite frequently when trying to find out information about Halcyon and has an entertaining persona as everyone's favorite granny that deals in highly illegal activities. Martin, on the other hand, is just a gold mine of comedy. His entire interaction is fantastic, and I loved every ironic piece of Spacer's Choice propaganda that left his mouth. Outside of these two, Junlei is the struggling leader trying to make ends meet, and there are some Mardet members that have a little substance to them. Overall, the faction is one of the stronger ones in the Outer Worlds, but based off what we've seen previously, that's not really saying much. While many of the characters aboard the ship are filler, there are enough tasks and characters that stand out to somewhat overcome this. The last big faction in the Outer Worlds is one I have largely ignored because they aren't relative to the narrative of the game. Sublight Salvage and Shipping Corporation are a shady organization that masks their more clandestine activities by masquerading as a salvaging company. This is a faction that I can provide some praise to. There is a substantial amount of content associated with this group and a fair amount of NPCs the player can interact with. Many of them are even memorable. There's the quest where you have to find a guy's carrier sprats that he uses to transport drugs. The interactions that you can have are entertaining, and eventually leads to you having to pick the drugs out of sprat droppings. While all you really do is run back and forth, I got a good laugh out of the ridiculousness of it all. The main quest for the faction is you just performing a bunch of slightly illegal activities for the head of the company. Except every mission has you finding experiments and scientists found in suspended animation. This all caps off with the theory that aliens are mutating mankind. I like that every task actually had an overarching goal that came together at the end. This concludes with you confronting a bored scientist who is really trying to adapt humans so they can survive off of the food found in Halcyon. This links back to the main plot with the colony being on the verge of starvation. A nice touch. Thankfully, you have some options here. You can either kill her to appease Sublight Salvage, let her continue her research for the board, or convince her to contact Phineas and work with him. These options are great. I just wish you can actually find her contacting Phineas if you chose that option. Despite the board being the primary antagonist, there's a surprisingly limited amount of interactions you can have with them. Also, most of the secondary factions are lacking characters or people to interact with. The big exceptions are MSI and Sublight, who have plenty of characters and memorable events centered around them. The second problem I have with factions is the benefits and repercussions for siding with them are limited. The only reward or punishment you get for helping or hurting a faction is increased or decreased vendor prices. Due to how easy it is to become rich in the Outer Worlds, this might as well mean nothing. If you get a faction to completely despise you, they will shoot you on sight, but only if the bar for liking you is under 25%. Otherwise, no matter what you do, they won't kill you. This is the only way to get locked out of doing content for a group besides murdering the people that give out the quests. There isn't a real benefit or downside for your actions involving a faction. They either passive-aggressively raise their prices, or lower them for you. This only further contributes to the problem I mentioned earlier where your actions don't really have any weight behind them because you don't lose or gain anything for performing them. I said I would move on to gameplay, and I ended up talking more about story-related content. Let's actually move on to gameplay for real this time. Combat is something you will be doing constantly throughout the Outer Worlds, so perhaps I should touch upon that subject. Finally. There are two methods of dealing damage in the game, guns and various melee weapons. There are no grenades, unarmed fisticuffs, or mines that you can use, although there are mine-based traps. Every weapon also has some kind of debuff associated with it, such as a heavy baton inflicting knockback or a pistol inflicting bleed. Remember these, I'm going to return to them soon. I've already mentioned tactical time dilation. On the defensive side, the player can equip 2 pieces of armor, a helmet, and, well, everything else I guess. There is also a leap the player can perform which is useful for creating distance between enemies or getting in close. The last key element of combat is stealth. If you've played an Elder Scrolls or Fallout game, there's nothing new here. You can crouch down and sneak up to opponents and land sneak attack criticals. All of this combined together makes up the core of combat in the Outer Worlds. So I want to return to those debuffs. I think they're a good way to illustrate what I think about combat. Some of them are insanely useful, to the point that I would consider them broken, such as Knockout, which causes a foe to be knocked prone and be unable to complete any action. On the other hand, some of these debuffs are fairly useless, with an example being Bleed, which causes light damage over time. The majority of enemies you will be fighting do not have a high amount of health and will die quickly. There isn't much room for damage over time effects against enemies you will be killing in a few seconds. In terms of overall usefulness, I found the majority of weapon debuffs to have an unnoticeable impact on gameplay. I've already gone over why damage over time isn't all that great for the majority of encounters. Debuffs like knockdown are useful, but in my experience playing the game, they hardly ever triggered. This made weapons with these debuffs appear to just deal pure damage, with no additional effects. There exist other debuffs, such as poison, burn, stun, knockdown, and a little more. The problem I have with all of these is they are all the exact same debuff. Burn and poison deal damage over time, stun and knockdown stop enemies from being able to either perform actions in the case of the former, or stop enemies from attacking. They're really just the same as bleed and knockout. Since they're all the same debuff with different names, that means none of them have any noticeable impact on gameplay. There are some unique examples, like Shrink or Glooped, but these are only found on a single science weapon. The debuff is the entire focus of the weapon, and they don't do much else. I found this to be pretty disappointing because all weapons, no matter what they are, serve only one real function, and that is to deal damage. You may be thinking, of course weapons are supposed to deal damage, that's why they're called weapons. Yes, you're right, but sometimes the utility something offers is what makes it useful rather than the pure damage numbers. Just look at some of the science weapons. Sadly, there are only 5 science weapons found throughout all of the Outer Worlds, and even one of these is only useful for its damage. I'm making a big deal out of these debuffs and lack of weapon utility because it leads into the biggest problem with the Outer Worlds combat. It is incredibly repetitive. Before I go on a multi-minute long tangent attempting to prove my point, which if you made it this far, you know I'm capable of, I want to say that the combat is competent overall, and while highly repetitive, it isn't bad. Shooting feels good, and combat is paced well enough. There are some bullet sponges in the game, but I always found these enemies to deserve the extra investment. Outside of Monarch, the game has a healthy balance of combat and character interaction. Sneaking can be used in almost every encounter, and the player does have the ability to create a build around the mechanic. The dodge is quick and snappy, allowing for quick movement around the battlefield. This helps tremendously with needing to find cover in a shootout, or keeping yourself on top of a foe in the case of melee. Although there were some occasions where I would dodge a projectile or melee attack and I would take damage anyway. TTD is also well integrated and balanced. Attacks consume a significant portion of the resource and never allow you to do so much damage that it feels broken. I found the ability was more useful when I needed some time to assess the situation or needed a quick heal, almost like a panic button in case I lost all my health and was about to die. Anyway, that whole point about repetitive combat in the Outer Worlds, yeah, maybe I should explain myself. What makes the game so repetitive is the complete lack of variety in every aspect of combat. I already spoke about weapon debuffs having no impact on gameplay, leading to most weapons' only utility being the damage they deal. Let's look at these tools more in depth. There are 3 types of ranged weapons: handguns, long guns, and heavy guns. Melee has 2 categories, one-handed and two-handed. I'm going to focus on guns for now. The 3 categories are what you would expect. Handguns are pistols that tend to deal lower amounts of damage, have small magazine size, and fast reload time. There are a few differences, with some being 3-round burst, but for the most part, they're all the same. Long guns have a wider selection of options. There are shotguns, automatic rifles, snipers, and plasma rifles. Heavy guns have some variety as well, with flamethrowers, plasma launchers, light and heavy machine guns, etc. I'm pointing all this out because what appears to be a decent amount of weapon variety is really just the same thing on repeat. Most handguns are exactly the same. The revolver is just a worse version of the Vermin. The same goes for the bolster pistol and the automag pistol. Then there's the only standard light pistol and the variations of the ulti-nature. This is it for all the handguns in the entire game. Long guns have assault rifles and light assault rifles, the only difference is the regular version does more damage. Then there's the sawed-off shotgun and the tactical shotgun. Yet again, the tactical version is just a pure upgrade from the sawed-off. This issue is prevalent in almost every single weapon in the entire game. Plasma rifles and carbines, hunting rifles and deadeye assault rifles, light machine guns and heavy machine guns. It would be easier to list the weapons in the game that don't have a direct upgrade. While I would prefer weapons that aren't better versions of ones already found in the game, they aren't a deal breaker. What is a deal breaker is when the game stops giving the player new weapons and decides to cycle through what was already used, but with versions that deal more damage. In case you didn't get it, this is exactly what the Outer Worlds does. You see, all gear in the Outer Worlds is tied to a level. The higher level of the weapon you find, the better it is. Some weapons start off at a higher level than others, making them immediately better than anything that is lower. Enemies do not drop the weapons they are using, instead they seem to give the player gear that is associated with their faction. Although I'm not entirely sure on this. To get an enemy to drop better gear, all you have to do is increase your level. Then instead of getting a revolver, you'll obtain the vermin. Basically, once you start reaching higher levels, more weapons start becoming available to you. Once you reach around level 12, every single weapon in the game will begin to repeat. The basic light pistol you obtained at the beginning of the game will start showing up again as the Mark II version. This version of the weapon is going to be better than most of the weapons you have available. This cycle repeats for almost every single weapon you already found in the game, the only difference being the guns are at higher levels and thus deal more damage. There is no unique feature between the first version and the Mark II option. I do want to add that if you like using a weapon that is worse, you can increase its level by tinkering with it. This allows you to enhance the lifespan of the gun, but only for a brief amount of time. However, tinkering with weapons can only go so far, because the price for doing so becomes exorbitant after only a few attempts. I've only been talking about guns, but melee is far worse. I mentioned earlier there exist two types, one-handed and two-handed. One-handed does less damage per hit, but it's faster than two-handed. The thing is, this leads to there being no reason to use two-handed weapons, because the extra damage isn't enough to make up for the low attack speed. One-handed speed allows it to completely outclass all two-handed melee weapons. I don't have the exact numbers on swing rate or the range of a melee weapon, so I can't say with absolute certainty how similar the two stats are for most swords, hammers, etc. I will say that most one-handed weapons felt similar in terms of reach, but would differ in attack speed. Although I eventually learned to just look at the big DPS number attached to a weapon when deciding to use it because that's all the game demands of the player. An element of guns and melee weapons I've been ignoring is the damage type they can inflict. There are 5 types of damage in the Outer Worlds. Plasma is strong against unarmored opponents, corrosion is useful against unarmored foes, shock is effective against automechanicals, and N-rays is powerful against organic enemies. Typically, damage types are like a game of rock, paper, scissors. Some are strong versus an enemy type while others are weak, forcing the player to switch the weapons they are using to properly deal with a foe. This isn't the case in the Outer Worlds. Physical is easily the worst damage type in the game. Any weapon will have its overall damage increased by simply adding some form of elemental damage to it, meaning there isn't any reason to use it. Plasma is strong against flesh, but is only weak against the Mantisaur. It is neutral or effective against everything else in the game. Corrosion isn't resisted by anything. It is strong against armored foes, including automechanicals, and is the only weakness Mantisaurs have. Shock isn't resisted either, but is only strong against automechanicals. N-rays is an odd type. It ignores a foe's armor and has an enemy spread damage over time to other nearby enemies. The damage type also has a weapon's overall damage cut by 50% if it is added through a mod. I found N-rays to be an ineffective type. The 50% trade-off wasn't worth the damage over time because, as I've said before, most foes die quickly. When fighting from a range, enemies tend to spread out. This means the unique spread of N-rays won't be very effective. If you're fighting enemies that cluster together, they tend to be melee, meaning they will be right on top of you. The N-ray damage will spread to all of your foes, but will also damage you and all of your companions. N-rays has the potential to deal the most damage, but the player will often not be in the ideal situation for the element. As you've probably noticed, there's a bit of a balancing issue here that only further enhances the repetitive nature of the game. Physical is worse than every other element in any situation, and N-rays often isn't useful either. That leaves only corrosion, shock, and plasma. Between these 3 elements, only one enemy group resists any of them, that being the Mantisaur versus plasma. Shock is useful against automechanicals, but since corrosion helps against armored foes, the damage difference between these two isn't that high. This makes corrosion the best overall damage type in the game. I said before, nothing in the game resists it, and it helps ignore some of the enemy's armor. Honestly, you could play the entire game with only corrosion weapons, and you would never have to switch to another damage type. The same could be said about shock, although it wouldn't be as effective as corrosion. Plasma is easily the best damage type against every creature in the game. It absolutely melts through Raptidons, Canids, Sprats, and Primals, and the only time you need to switch out of it is against Mantisaurs. With that being said, corrosion and shock will still get the job done effectively because none of these enemies resist either element. This all means for the majority of encounters you don't need to think about what element you should use. There's little need for strategy, just pick whatever you're in the mood for and kill everything in sight. There is no careful game of rock, paper, scissors. I choose gun and blow everything away. Traditionally, different damage types force the player to experiment. They may not know what an enemy is weak to, and are forced to find out if they want to overcome a challenge. Perhaps the element has a status effect that can be taken advantage of to overcome an obstacle. None of this is in the Outer Worlds. There are weapon mods that allow you to change what the damage type of a weapon is. These aren't the only mods available though. All weapons and armor have a handful of mods that can be used on them. Mods for guns include increased magazine size, faster fire rate, decreased weapon sway, different sights, and increased crit damage. The bonuses weapon mods give themselves are useful to have and help add some variety to gameplay, although most gun mods are for general use and not for specific types of guns. I believe the Outer Worlds should have incorporated more personalized mods, like increased charge-up rate for the plasma rifle or carbine, on top of the general use ones. Melee weapon mods are another story. There's basically nothing here at all. All you can do is change the damage type, power attack damage, durability, and swing rate. Whenever you add a mod, the best option is to just add swing rate, which increases the DPS of the weapon. Maybe change the damage type if you're feeling fancy, and that's it for melee. Honestly, it's pretty disappointing. Everything else just isn't worth it because it doesn't have a substantial impact on the game. Mods for armor are a little in between the other two in terms of utility. Some increase a specific stat or stats by 5 to 10 points, which isn't all that useful, while others are fairly practical, an example being increased movement speed in TTD, or your dodge length by 30%. There are also mods that increase your resistance to a type of damage, such as corrosion or plasma. These aren't all that great because they sacrifice the armor piece's resistance to other types of damage, and usually the increase isn't anything substantial. I've had this giant overarching theme on how every combat mechanic is a missed opportunity that leads to repetition, so the question has to be asked, how does it fit in here? Well, I'm glad you asked. There isn't much of a reason to use them. This has to do with the leveling system and how often you'll be switching weapons. Since you are constantly leveling up and receiving new gear to equip, there isn't much of a reason to add mods to your weapons. You can't remove the mods you add to something, so they're a one-time use. Add on that mods are actually one of the only less common resources in the game, and suddenly I don't want to waste my resources on a gun that I won't be using in the too distant future. This only stops becoming a problem towards the last third of the game, because now you're a higher level, and new weapons are being given out less frequently. While the issue is somewhat alleviated, I still don't believe it is acceptable to have the way loot is given to the player work against using mods. With all this in mind, I believe it's pretty clear how this only makes the game's combat even more repetitive. Enemies do not drop modded versions of weapons, and armor usually only comes with stat increasing mods attached. Combine this with the player not being incentivized to use mods, and every single weapon and piece of armor is only used in its base form for a substantial portion of the game. The player is mostly using unmodded weapons with additional effects that have little to no impact on gameplay, damage types that aren't balanced properly, and a complete lack of variety. But wait, there's more. The Outer Worlds has unique weapons. I've sectioned these off into two categories, ones that have unique effects, and others that are just modded versions of weapons that already exist. Let me expand upon the first option. Let's look at the Anti-Manta Ray as an example. This is a unique version of the plasma carbine. Traditionally, the weapon is a rifle that shoots plasma and is semi-automatic. You can charge up the shot to increase the damage the gun does. The Anti-Manta Ray does corrosion damage and shoots in a 3-round burst. You cannot charge the weapon at all. I would consider this a unique version of the plasma carbine because you cannot add any of these effects through mods. This weapon cannot be recreated. I have nothing negative to say about this category, in fact, only praise. They do add more weapon variety to the game, and finding them makes the player feel properly rewarded for exploring the world. They're basically an entire new weapon added to the game. The other category is the complete opposite. They're weapons that have unique names, but they're really just modded versions of the ordinary guns you can find in the game. Even the damage numbers are the same. You can recreate these weapons by simply modifying a non-unique version of the weapon and tinkering with it a little. They aren't truly unique, and are just a slightly better version of something you already have. You also cannot add, remove, or replace mods on a unique weapon, so you're stuck with whatever the developers attach to it. This has the opposite effect. It's just the same weapon you can already find in the game, and it feels like an underwhelming reward for exploring the world or completing a quest. I hope by now I have properly illustrated the lack of variety in weapons. The last element of the Outer Worlds that makes combat repetitive are the enemies. For most of the game, you will be fighting marauders. These are your standard humanoids that shoot or run at you with melee weapons. The thing is, you will be fighting the exact same marauders the entire game. They never once change their armor and always behave exactly the same. There exist other humanoids like corporate soldiers, but they behave just like marauders as well. The creatures in the game aren't that much better. There are primals, raptidons, mantisaurs, sprats, and canids. All of them have variations of themselves, but these variations often end up just being stronger and bigger versions of ones that already exist. This isn't always the case, though. The Mantisaur species has swarms of manta younglings that hone in on the player and shoot waves of plasma, manta pillars that shoot acid from afar, mantisaurs, and manta queens. Raptidons have melee bruisers and versions that shoot acid from afar. Primals, Cadence, and Sprats only have the mega or enhanced version of themselves, though. To be fair, Raptidons and Mantisaurs also have their own souped-up version as well. So there are only really 5 types of creatures in the entire game, and 3 different auto-mechanicals. These creatures do have alternate versions, but many of them are the exact same enemy with better stats. 2 of the auto-mechanicals are mostly the same, with only the scrap mechanical adding any variety. All humanoid enemies behave in the exact same way. While all of this is a problem with variety, the bigger issue is how these enemies are mixed together. What I mean by this is you will be fighting the exact same pack of foes all the time. You see this pack of Marauders? Well, now you've seen them all, because besides adding in a scrap mechanical or a few canids, every single composition of Marauders is the same. Combining them with auto mechanicals hardly ever happens. Sprats are mostly filler enemies used to distract or give the player something to easily kill when exploring certain areas. All creatures hate each other in the game and will never work together. When fighting a pack of Raptidons, you'll be fighting the exact same 2 enemies all the time. Mantisaurs are nice and have a good amount of variety, but after you fight your 10th pack of the same combination of enemies, it just gets dull. Everything seems nice at first. New enemies are introduced and the player is constantly gaining access to new weapons. However, once you get through a third of the game, you start receiving the Mark II versions of weapons and the 50th pack of the same Marauders begins to overstay its welcome. Mods just don't give the player enough options and the loot system de-incentivizes using them altogether. Honestly, almost everything about combat seems to edge it closer and closer to an uninteresting repeat of the same gun or melee fight over and over again with no end in sight. So with all this overwhelming evidence, I hope I've convinced you how repetitive the combat in the Outer Worlds truly is. With my massive tangent out of the way, I'm not quite finished talking about combat. There are 2 things that I believe warrant a further discussion: perks and flaws. Don't worry, this won't take nearly as long. Well, at least I hope. Anyway, let's move on to perks. They're divided into 3 tiers. In the beginning, you can only have access to the first tier, but once you gain 5 perks, you gain access to the next tier. This repeats for unlocking the 3rd tier. Also, you only gain a perk every time you level up a second time. Once you gain access to a tier the perk is in, you can take that perk at any time. I've been trying to not compare the Outer Worlds to the Fallout franchise, but here I go. In Fallout New Vegas 3, and to a lesser extent 4, perks are tied to your stats. You cannot just equip whatever perk you feel like having. Instead, you have to have the appropriate amount of skill points and attributes to gain access to a perk. For instance, if you have enough sneak and agility, you can avoid setting off traps. I believe this system works well. Choices you make when building a character matter. In Fallout, changing your special stats is a rare occurrence. If you don't have anywhere near the agility needed for a perk, then that perk is lost forever. The idea here isn't to punish the player for not putting enough points into a stat, but to instead help facilitate unique characters depending on how you choose to build them. If the player invests 8 points into strength, they gain extra points in skills which in turn gives them access to perks that relate to those stats and attribute. These tend to be bonuses that a particularly strong person would be capable of doing. Add in a skill requirement like melee and now you can focus on a particular mechanic in-game. Let's say to get 8 strength, you had to lower your intelligence to 3. Well, now you aren't going to have access to perks that require even a moderate amount of intelligence. Maybe you could even be rewarded for having low intelligence. Certain perks require you to be strong, but also stupid. This give and take is fundamental to an RPG because it facilitates actually role-playing a type of character. I'm not going to sit and pretend Fallout has the best RPG mechanics ever, and that what I just spoke about is perfectly captured in those games. The whole point of this comparison is to illustrate how perks can be utilized to enhance a player's experience. In the Outer Worlds, how you design your character doesn't have any impact on what perks are available to you. I've already explained how perks are distributed to the player, so I hope this wasn't some grand revelation to anyone. You don't need to spend any time figuring out how you want to distribute your skills and attributes so you can get a specific perk. Instead, you can just pick any perk you want, and your skills and attributes don't matter at all. However, it's not just how you unlock them that I view as a problem, but the bonuses they offer as well. Some examples are health plus 50% or extra movement speed during TTD for 5 seconds. What these two have in common is no matter how you decide to play the game, they are useful. There's no reason why someone wouldn't want 50% more health. This is the majority of perks in the Outer Worlds. I'm not saying having bonuses that are useful for all playstyles is a bad thing, but when the majority of the perks found in a game are just that, it becomes an issue. Let's suppose you wanted to boot up the Outer Worlds and start an entirely new character. You decide to make a strong and dexterous character that only uses melee weapons. Looking at all the perks available, there's only one perk in the entire lineup that only assists this style of gameplay. Everything else that you would want are flat bonuses to companions, more health, better negotiations on vendor prices, faster movement speed, TTD enhancements, increased base armor, and more carry weight. Almost all other playstyles in the game would want these bonuses. The only thing you're contemplating is what is the best perk in terms of general utility, not for the character being played. You will be picking the exact same perks every playthrough because the best perks for one character are the best perks for every other playstyle. I can't help but plug in that this only further adds to the repetitive style of the game. I do have to be fair and point out that not every single perk is like this. There do exist perks that increase science weapon damage or give extra bonuses to ranged weapons. While the gun enhancing perks cover all ranged weapons instead of something like only heavy guns or handguns, it's better than nothing. I mentioned that I would also talk about flaws, so let's move on to that subject. Flaws are meant to be little quirks that your character has. All of them are negative modifiers, but if you take a flaw, you are granted a perk point. I should mention that you don't have to take a flaw if you view the cost as too high. You're meant to gain them by just playing the game naturally. For instance, if you're constantly receiving corrosive damage, you may be given the chance to take a flaw which increases the corrosive damage you take. These flaws happen randomly, so it adds replayability to the game by helping create a unique character for each playthrough. It's a shame that I believe that they didn't implement the mechanic very well, because it had high potential. I say this for a couple of reasons. The first one being many flaws are so terrible that they are never worth taking. Permanently crippled lowers your movement speed by 30% and stops you from being able to dodge for the rest of the game. Let me tell you, that is not worth a perk point. That isn't the only example. Food addiction withdrawal lowers perception, dexterity, and temperament forever. That's half your attributes all being lowered for a single perk. Now you could argue that these add some actual depth to a player's character even if the penalties are extreme. Maybe people want to be overweight cripples. Sure, that's all fine. It's your character. You can choose what you want to do with them. But this leads into my next reason why I don't like flaws. There's not really much of a reason to take most of them. Perk points are useful in the beginning of the game, but as you progress, they kind of just fall off. I'd already taken most of the high-value general utility perks, and I didn't really see that much to gain from getting any new perks, which means there wasn't much of a reason to incur a negative penalty from these flaws. This is an issue I'm going to expand upon later, but for now I'm just going to stop talking about it here. I also found that many of the flaws are just copy and paste of each other. There are flaws that make you take 25% extra damage for corrosion, physical, and plasma damage. Then there are flaws for being near raptidons, mantisaurs, automechanicals, and canids. All of these give the exact same debuff as well. The last reason is there aren't enough of them in the game. There are only 12. That means in this video I've already listed more than half of them in my examples alone, and most of them were just copies of each other. I really like the concept of the flaw mechanic. If implemented correctly, I believe it could have really enhanced the experience. Perhaps instead of giving a perk, flaws gave a pro and a con related to what caused the flaw to begin with. Something like traits in the older Fallout games. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but whatever. They would further help create unique characters for every playthrough, especially because they are given out randomly, making it harder to control when you acquire a flaw. Sure, you could just sit and metagame the system, but there isn't much a developer can do about that. I don't have much of a segue into my next topic, so let's just forge on ahead. I said I would explain why I think the Outer Worlds is too easy, and I'm finally going to justify that statement. It's only been, 13,000 words since I first said I would get here. Perfectly fine. Anyway, let's start talking about resource management, or the complete lack of it. Ammo, bits, items to repair gear, lockpicks, bypass chutes, Adreno, none of this is hard to come by. Let's look at the root of the problem. Every single room in the Outer Worlds has some combination of the things I listed. When I say every room, I am not exaggerating. You literally can't go anywhere in the game without tripping over a bit container or another pack of one of the 3 types of ammo. It's as if the game is afraid to not constantly reward the player with some kind of goodie whenever they stumble upon a container. By the time I left Edgewater, I already had hundreds, if not 1,000 of each type of ammo, and over 10,000 bits. While I was still lacking lockpicks and bypass chutes, it didn't take long for that problem to go away. This snowballs into another problem. If it takes no effort to obtain an abundance of something, it stops having any value. This is basic supply and demand. I never cared whenever I found another bit container or was given some for completing a quest. This is because if I already have so much of everything I would spend my bits on, then I have nothing to spend it on. During my multiple playthroughs of the Outer Worlds, I never once bought any ammo, and I would rarely buy armor or weapons. Sometimes I would purchase lockpicks just for the sake of it. This is true for every other resource in the game, besides mods. I would collect ammo or lockpicks because there isn't much of a reason not to, but after amassing so much of something, it just begins to feel meaningless and more like a chore. All the excitement out of exploring the world was gone, because all I could find were the limited variety of weapons that I most likely had, or some resource I already had thousands of. I don't think it's very challenging to understand why a lack of resource management makes a game easy. The player never has to stop and consider their options on how to defeat a foe or solve a problem. You can just spam healing items because you have so much Adreno that wasting a significant amount of it doesn't mean anything. You have so much of every type of ammo that dealing enough damage never becomes a problem. Even then, you can easily increase a weapon's damage output by tinkering with it, and all that does is cost some bits. Another resource that you feel like you have an infinite supply of. Then there are the perks that are so powerful that it becomes a challenge to even die. Being able to gain 50% more health as the first perk you ever take is no joke. Add on being able to gain 15% of your max health every time you kill an enemy, and kiss death goodbye. There is a perk that allows you to gain 15% of the damage you deal with a melee weapon back as HP. During my melee build, this was bonkers. Just look at me fighting 2 Manta Queens, so much for some of the strongest enemies in the game. The Reaper perk allows you to gain TTD whenever you kill an enemy, and there's another perk that allows you to recharge the bar even faster. Forget taking damage, I'll just slow down time and kill everything before they even realize they're dead yet. Since there's no reason to not choose the best perks available to you, you're always going to be picking these best options, which means you're always going to be overpowered no matter how you choose to build your character. This is all without even factoring in companions that deal a significant amount of damage and take aggro away from you. Some even have abilities that stun or knock out foes for you, completely taking them out of the fight for a few precious seconds. The last point I have is how easy it is to become a jack-of-all-trades character. I've already gone over this in depth, so I'm not going to repeat myself on why this is. If you're good at everything, then you have no weaknesses. This sounds great in practice, but playing a game where you can just speed through every skill check becomes dull over time. You no longer have to be creative or pick a specific path based on the character you built. Yet again, your decisions have no weight to them, and all manner of challenge just goes out the window. Broken record time. Players should be rewarded if they choose to invest in a specific set of skills, and then they need to face a punishment if because of that investment, they have to cut back on something else. You may be able to talk your way out of conflict, but once a fight becomes unavoidable, you're going to have a rough time. Many times this simply isn't the case in the Outer Worlds. Before I transition to companions, I want to talk about the restricted access areas and the holographic shroud. Sadly, I don't have anything positive to say about this either. It's comically easy to use the shroud. First, all sense of realism is thrown out the window. The shroud makes you appear as a member of the faction you are sneaking into by covering you and your companions in a hologram of their armor. This is automatically done whenever walking past a giant gate that literally reads restricted access. Not only does this gate look ridiculous, but simply walking past it triggers the shroud immediately. One minute you're wearing your standard gear, and the next you're covered in a full set of faction armor. Often you do this right in front of people, and nobody comments on it. They all just pretend that they didn't just see you magically morph into a guard. The game even pokes fun at this by allowing the player to say just wearing a disguise would be more practical. Phineas just brushes this off as not true, but it actually makes a lot of sense. With an actual piece of physical armor, you wouldn't have to worry about the hologram glitching out, and if someone went to touch you, their hand wouldn't just slip right through you. Mechanically, the shroud allows the player to travel through restricted areas on a time limit. You have 3 chances for guards to notice a flaw or glitch in your disguise. Once all 3 have been exhausted, the area becomes hostile to you. If you perform suspicious actions like running or jumping, then the bar decreases faster. The problem is how difficult it is to actually get discovered. These 3 chances are always more than enough time for you to get through an area, and even if a bar fully decreases, all you have to do is pass a minor speech check or bribe someone to keep walking through the area. It's ridiculously easy, and I never once got caught. There's no real punishment for acting like a fool, and the whole thing comes across as a joke when you're supposed to be sneaking through a classified area. The final topic of this video will be the various companions you can encounter in the Outer Worlds. My opinion on the crew members you can recruit is positive overall. I want to begin by looking at the companions as a whole, and then spending time on each one individually. When I say as a whole, what I really mean is examining what a companion in the Outer Worlds adds to the game. Mostly they each add their own custom flair to your adventures. The way the game handles this is really well done. Companions will comment on everywhere you go, and everything you do. The sheer amount of dialogue that is just your companions having minor quips about where you are is fantastic. I could walk into some random filler room, and someone would have something to say about it. Every area and monument you visit or walk by will warrant a remark. Many times they correlate to events transpiring around where you currently are as well. Also, most actions that you perform in the game will have earned you a comment from one of your companions. Felix is anti-bored to a fault, and will not shy away from speaking his mind if you begin to work for them. Even just agreeing to perform a task for Udom Bedford on the Groundbreaker will earn his ire. Ellie is a loner that believes everyone will eventually stab you in the back. If you perform more selfish acts, she will voice how she agrees with your actions and justify them. I really enjoyed when companions did this, because their input would actually have an effect on my decision making. Perhaps they would bring up a perspective I hadn't thought of before. Companions also interject their own thoughts into conversations you are having. A character may be responding to something you said, and all of a sudden your companion will cut in and voice their opinion or shift the conversation to something else. They also have conversations with each other and interactions aboard your ship. Most of these tend to be funny little skits that show the dynamic the two companions have with one another. Some get along well, like Parvati and Sam, while others hate each other. Personally, I didn't really care for most of the moments aboard the Unreliable, but listening to Parvati talk to Sam while walking around was always a joy. All of these elements together create characters that feel like real people on an adventure with you. They have opinions and thoughts of their own, instead of just being pack mules that carry your stuff around and take aggro away from enemies for you. The interactions they have with one another only enhance this even further. You become invested in them as characters, and actively look forward to how your actions will affect these people and vice versa. Although not everything is sunshine and rainbows for these characters, companions will speak out about your actions that they disagree with, but won't threaten to leave or do anything about it. When Sophia asks you to kill everyone in Edgewater, Parvati is just a little upset about the idea. If you agree to perform the task, she says nothing. No comment about how she will never forgive you, or her trying to convince you to do otherwise. The only character that calls you out is Felix, and even then he won't leave the group. I thought Felix should have left the group much earlier as a consequence of working for the board. The guy is an extreme anarchist who hates the board. He should not be willing to work with you after you go around murdering an innocent person just to gain some money. Parvati should have left you the moment you went through with getting everyone in Edgewater murdered. It really is completely unforgivable. In fact, once you gain Parvati as a companion, you can kill everyone in Edgewater at any time and she has no comment whatsoever. She'll even happily murder everyone that she has ever known. Felix used to run with the Outlaws on the Groundbreaker, and he has no qualms with you murdering all of his old friends. You tell him to perform his signature dropkick, and he does it with gusto. This isn't true for every companion though. If you murder Ellie's parents during her quest, she will freak out at you. In terms of gameplay, companions have more than just a couple flaws. They often sprint headfirst into the middle of a pack of enemies and easily get themselves killed. You can change their settings so this happens less frequently, but it's not very effective. It works sometimes, but they often end up not listening anyway. You can order a companion to keep their distance, and they still somehow end up dead in the middle of the fight. This becomes a huge issue on Supernova difficulty, where companions die permanently. Your followers also have access to a unique ability. These skills are a slow-mo that interrupts combat and deals free damage to an enemy. The animation is nice to see at first, but gets tiring after you've seen it for the entire playthrough. The overall usefulness of these vary. Nyoka and Ellie deal free damage to an enemy, which is fine, while Max and Parvati have a chance to stun and knock out opponents and deal damage. I found these to be very powerful, as taking out an enemy, even if it's just one, is always a strong benefit to have. None of these skills are supposed to be spammable, as they recharge after being used, although there are some perks that allow them to recharge faster or have a chance to skip recharging altogether. Chaining these together can break most encounters. I will admit that it is challenging to pull this off consistently though, and wasn't much of a problem. I do think it would have been nice to add a special ability if two specific companions were paired together. It could take up both of their abilities, and be some cool team-up move that could be earned by seeing specific interactions or moments with two characters. Companions also offer bonuses to your skills when you have them in your party. These tend to be something the character would seem to be good at, except for Felix enhancing my persuasion. That makes no sense. These enhancements often broke any form of character balancing. It's already easy to become a jack-of-all-trades character, but the sheer amount of skill points you can gain from your companions is nuts. Each companion offers to increase 3 skills by 10. You can also take companion perks that further increase one of those stats by 10. More on those in a minute. This is already over at least 10 extra skill points to 6 skills if you have 2 companions in your party. Possibly even more if 2 companions increase the same skill, which they can. The thing is, there exists a way to double the skill bonuses companions give you. It's one of the 20-point bonuses you get from increasing inspiration. With this, you can have your companions give you plus 50 points in a stat. This should not be possible.
It breaks all sense of character creation and means as long as you have the right companions in your party, you can pass any check in the game without having to invest any skill points at all, or barely any. If you've watched this far, you know how much I love my RPG character creation. In my opinion, this is catastrophic to any sense of balance in the Outer Worlds. Moving on to companion perks, they're a big letdown. Most of them don't have any substantial effect on gameplay, and almost all of them are exactly the same for each companion. The bonuses mostly enhance the companions themselves, but some affect the entire party. Most of these perks aren't particularly useful because companions are unreliable at best. They often get themselves killed in fights anyway, with or without these perks. This only further detracts the value for most of these because if a companion is knocked out, these bonuses aren't doing anything anyway. This could have been an opportunity to spice up how you factor in companions into a fight, or put some of their personalities into gameplay. Instead, they are just flat modifiers that don't really say anything about the character. Okay, this is mostly true. Companions do have 4 unique skills only available to each one of them. These are the ones that either affect you or the entire party. These perks are fine and are usually in theme with the character. However, the downside is, there's no reason to ever not pick these. Considering your companion's survivability and how difficult it is to control them, there is very little reason to choose to buff them over yourself. This mostly concludes what I have to say about companions in terms of gameplay. Now I'm going to move on to them as characters. Most members of the crew aren't that developed, although there is one notable exception. To get this out of the way, I won't be focusing on Sam, because I view him as more of a joke companion that doesn't have a character at all. This leaves Ellie, Felix, Parvati, Max, and Nyoka. I want to say that I don't think any of these characters are bad, just that some are underwhelming, while others clearly got more time invested in them. The most underwhelming are definitely Ellie and Felix. Ellie's primary character trait is that she doesn't like to rely on or get too close to others. The only reason she joins your crew is because you help her out and she hates owing other people favors. She has become this type of person due to growing up in Byzantium where the people only looked out for themselves. There really isn't much else to talk about here in terms of her character. She's definitely entertaining to be around, but there's little depth here. Even her companion quest is lacking. Ellie was born and raised in Byzantium as a surgeon. She abandons that life, but now wants to show her parents how much of a delinquent she's become. Her parents' reaction to her leaving was to fake her death and get a fortune on her life insurance. When you and Ellie find this out, you help transfer the money over to Ellie's account instead of her parents'. I didn't really understand what this had to do with her character, or why it should motivate her to rely more on others. It felt more like a chore, rather than something that allowed me to gain a better understanding of Ellie. Maybe I'm missing something here. Felix is the second weakest party member. Much like Ellie, there isn't much outside of his core personality trait, being a bit of a rebel. Felix grew up on the Groundbreaker as an orphan and never had a place to call home in life. He despises the board because of how their policies treat outcasts like him. While Felix's heart is in the right place, he's incredibly bullheaded, completely stuck in his beliefs and unwilling to compromise. He also has a tendency to shoot first and ask questions later. Besides being a board-hating, stubborn anarchist, there isn't anything else that comes to mind when I think of Felix. Well, there is a love of tossball, but that's about it. Felix's quest is a mixed bag. One of his old mentors contacts him and wants to meet up. He tries to convince Felix to leave you and join his rebellion against the board. Felix is a little iffy on this, and the guy asks you to murder a traitor to the cause for him. I can't really do it justice, but it's obvious from the get-go that the old mentor is not who he says he is. You travel all over the colony just to have a conversation with a couple people, and you eventually discover that, surprise, the old mentor is actually working for the board. You confront him about this, and then you kill him. While the contents of this quest are less than stellar, I found the overall lesson and impact on Felix to be good. It teaches him to actually put a little more thought into his beliefs and question what he believes to be true. Someone he respected and admired was actually just another corrupt board stooge. Not everything is as black and white as he first thought, and looks can be deceiving. Nyoka is the last companion you will most likely encounter in the Outer Worlds. Yet again, I have to begin by saying there isn't much depth to her character, although she is more substantial than Ellie and Felix. Nyoka is an alcoholic hunter who helps guide people through Monarch. She's decently sarcastic and is partial to unloading large machine gun magazines into her enemies. All the interactions you can have with Nyoka rely on these character traits. She'll talk to you about the best way to murder a raptidon, or how to sneak up on the wildlife, but that's it. There is little else that Nyoka ever talks about, and she seems very detached from everything outside of what she is familiar with on Monarch. The saving grace for Nyoka is her quest, and what you learn about her from it. Nyoka used to be a part of a survival group called Charon. The group's base was overrun by a Manta Queen, and Nyoka wants revenge. Before this, she wants to locate every other member of her old group, dead or alive. As you continue the quest, every single member of the old crew is found to be dead. Nyoka knew about most of the deaths, however some of them came as a surprise to her. 2 members even abandoned the rest of them to start a new life on Terra 2, but died anyway. The quest concludes with you storming the base, killing the Manta Queen, and either leaving the group's old medallions together in their base, or having Nyoka hold on to them. What the quest does give you is an understanding of why Nyoka is the way she is. She's a drunk because staying sober makes her think of all of her old friends and all the painful emotions that come with losing people that are like family. When she's not drunk, she's busy rampaging through Monarch so that she's so psyched up on adrenaline that she doesn't have to think about anything else. The quest represents Nyoka finally confronting her past and putting to rest all of the people that she lost over the years. It all culminates with her realizing that she may just have a new family with you and your crew. The tasks you take to achieve this are fairly boring, but the emotional payoff and character growth are well worth the effort.
The next companion is Vicar Maximilian de Soda. Judging by the title Vicar, it's easy to tell Max is a religious man. He is a follower of scientism, which has some rather interesting beliefs. I won't be going over the religion in depth. What is important to know for Max's character is the idea of a universal equation that, if solved, can answer every question mankind could ever pose, and that people are all born with a certain role to play out. If someone strays too far from the designated role, they will be snapped back by the universe to where they should be. Max is fanatical about solving the universal equation. The reason why has less to do with fame or prestige, but about Max as a person. Max was born as a nobody. His parents were religious farmers who led an uninteresting life. Max was not content to live like his parents, and due to their religious ways, became obsessed with scientism and thus the universal equation. He desperately wants to solve the equation because he believes it would show him what his purpose in life is, and give him inner peace. The whole purpose of the religion is to stop people from posing questions or fighting their place in society, because their life has already been predetermined. Sounds perfect for corrupt corporations trying to enslave people, am I right? Max believes that he is destined for so much more than a quiet farmer's life. He even changes his mannerisms to emulate what he believed he should be, a well-disciplined scholar constantly in the pursuit of higher knowledge. He's not very good at accomplishing this goal. Max has a strong temper that often causes him to act in an almost barbaric way, threatening acts of violence to those who cross him, and he's not even above murdering them. Max is also a blatant hypocrite. He constantly tells people that whatever happens to them is only bringing them closer to what they are supposed to do in life, that the universe is self-correcting. Only he is constantly fighting against what his religion would view as his place in society. Max is suppressing his true self and desperately trying to distance himself from his parents' lifestyle. With all this backstory, it isn't hard to realize that Max has identity issues. He's stuck between being who he is and who he thinks he should be. Throughout all of Max's questline, he's trying to find answers and further educate himself. But ironically, his faith goes against the very principle, instead teaching you to be content with your place in life and to not question anything simply because the universe said so. I mean, who are we to argue with the universe itself? I'm just some chump making a ridiculously long video that overanalyzes a video game. What do I know? Sadly, the game doesn't do a very good job of presenting Max. Everything I just said was me spending more time than I care to admit thinking about Max and the deeper meanings behind his character. You would be forgiven if you didn't reach these conclusions yourself while playing the game, especially because his quest, which is meant to highlight some of the conclusions I came to, is vague at best. The biggest moment for Max is the end of his quest line, where you experience a psychedelic acid trip that forces Max to confront the storm raging inside him. He speaks with visions of his mother and himself, and then depending on how you nudged him, he either stays exactly the same or completely changes his entire set of beliefs, giving up on order and just letting the chaos of the universe guide him. There is no equation. Whatever happens, happens. The scene itself is pretty hard to follow, and unless you have been paying close attention to Max, you most likely won't have any idea what's going on. Writing vague scenes that are open to interpretation is not necessarily a bad thing. However, in the outer worlds where the writing is pretty basic and easy to follow the majority of the time, this doesn't work. The other issue I see is it isn't realistic for someone to change their entire life view based on one experience. Max has spent his entire life pondering about the universal equation. He has spent years in prison and is willing to murder people to obtain answers, and all it takes for him to give up is some acid trip where his mother tells him to chill. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty realistic to me. The final companion and topic of this video is Parvati. It's pretty clear that Parvati got the most development time out of all the companions. She's a mechanic that prefers the company of machines rather than human beings. She often gives them names and talks to them while performing maintenance. Parvati is socially awkward and often doesn't know how to express herself. This leads to her stumbling over her words or using strange mechanical descriptions to try and get her point across. While this may come across as odd at first, I found it to be quite endearing. Parvati is the equivalent of a sweet little cinnamon roll that causes people on Reddit to cry out, "must protect," in all caps. There are a lot of tiny details that went into Parvati's character, more so than any other companion. She has a house in Edgewater you can explore. While you're busy looting her home, she will have various lines of dialogue that reflect where you currently are or what you are doing. Inside her home, there is a terminal detailing some personal information about Parvati and her dad. There's even a nice picture of him and her that she will bring aboard your ship. One of the Edgewater deserters has a crush on her, and the two of them will have some minor banter when you talk to him. You can ask Parvati about her past, and she will detail how she was sent off to school to train as a mechanic, but didn't get along with the other students. She mostly just wanted to spend time with the machines, and eventually found her own little hideaway to escape her roommate. When Parvati comes back from school, her father is significantly older and relies on her for support. They would only have a year together after she returned. These more minuscule details aren't necessary, but help flesh out and make Parvati feel like a person who has lived an actual life. She isn't just some NPC whose entire existence began once they interacted with you, or has some minor attempt at a backstory. None of the previous companions have this problem either, but it's pretty clear that Parvati had a little extra effort put in, and by a little extra effort, I mean, who are these people again? All I know is my one true love, Cinnamon Roll Parvati. Much like the character herself, Parvati's questline is done well. It's a tale of two awkward mechanics falling in love with one another. Knowing Parvati's general awkwardness, a whole lot of emotional angst comes into play. The other mechanic is Junlei. Originally, Parvati only wanted to learn how to improve her skills handling spacecrafts. However, things escalate for the two of them. Both of them are too shy to actually be upfront about how they feel. Junlei decides the best way to express herself is to send Parvati mechanical poetry that subtly, or not really so subtly, implies she has feelings for her. Just saying that out loud sounds absolutely ridiculous, but it's supposed to be. The poetry causes Parvati to question whether or not Junlei actually likes her. Eventually Junlei mentions some other girl named Isabel, and Parvati gets all upset about it. You take her out to drink and help her gain some confidence. It all culminates with Parvati asking Junlei out on a date. This leads to you having to travel around the entire star system to ensure your Cinnamon Roll's date goes perfectly. Everything ends with the two of them agreeing to go steady. The real strength behind this questline are the interactions you have with Parvati. She's never been in love before and doesn't enjoy the physical aspect of relationships. Due to her lack of experience, your mechanic often consults you for dating advice. These are the true shining moments of the questline. The writers did a fantastic job making Parvati act like a teenager that just wants everything to work out, but has no idea how to make that conclusion happen. When I think back on all the components that go into companions in the Outer Worlds, there are a lot of strengths and weaknesses. I like the effort put in to make them feel a part of your journey and have them come across as real people with lives outside of your own. Although when it comes to gameplay and some of their characters, they aren't nearly as dynamic, and some of them come across as somewhat one-dimensional. So this just about concludes everything I have to say about the Outer Worlds. I stand by my statement made at the beginning of the video. The Outer Worlds is a game that has a lot of untapped potential. There are a lot of good ideas inside this game. The setting is fantastic, and the idea of having an entire colony run by 10 big money corporations is great. The game is genuinely funny, and has plenty of wacky characters and ridiculous lines of dialogue. The consistent issue is, many things often aren't executed to their full potential. Instead, many elements of the Outer Worlds come across as half-baked. Look at the main quest. The player is given two sides to align with, but no matter what side you choose, you end up doing the exact same thing regardless. Many of the factions in the game don't have enough development or even people to make them feel like an actual faction. They mostly consist of soldiers that regurgitate 5 filler lines back to the player. Combat grows stale because there are no options. You're constantly fighting the exact same enemies you've already faced 100 times. This is only further damaged by how little weapons and modifications there are. Flaws are almost useless, and the world building is non-existent. The thing that really bothers me here is there is a solid foundation. I don't know if there were a lot of budget constraints or developers had to rush the game out, but so many of the issues in this game are created due to laziness. Almost like they couldn't be bothered with so many elements of the game. You know, just put enough effort into combat to make it serviceable, or change up the events of the story slightly depending on which side you pick. I look at characters like Parvati, or some of the great humor found in the game, and think, why isn't the same amount of effort found in the rest of the game? There seemed to be so much care put into the first third of the game, but then everything slowly begins to fall apart, and the cracks in the game's armor begin to show. What I am hopeful for is in Outer Worlds 2. I believe if it's given enough time and an effort is put in to enhance some of the ideas attempted here, it could be something special. Even if a sequel is created, that doesn't stop the Outer Worlds from being a shallow experience. So these final statements don't have anything to do with the critique. If you're hearing this, that means I somehow managed to entertain you for a whole 2 hours. Not quite sure how I pulled that one off, but nonetheless, thanks for watching. A fair amount of effort was put into this video, so this is the part where I sell out and ask for a subscription, or a like, or something, I don't know. If you're feeling generous, or just enjoyed the video, maybe consider doing one of the things I mentioned, or not. It's really your call. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you again.